I just want to make sure everyone hears what was offered, sayings, and who it was offered about.
Get him out of here. I don't care what his ticket says. Sir, I understand your concern, but this passenger has a valet. I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. Move him, and I'll make it worth your while. A pause. A long, heavy pause. And then a voice. Calm. Quiet. Unbothered. You don't have to answer him. Everyone on that plane turned to look. Not at the man in the expensive suit. Not at the flight attendant whose hands were shaking. They looked at the boy, 11 years old, sitting perfectly still, eyes forward, like he had been waiting for exactly this moment. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because this particular story, doesn't start with that confrontation on the plane. It starts 3 weeks earlier, in a small apartment on the east side of Detroit, Michigan, where a boy named Marcus Jerome Allen sat at a kitchen table covered in index cards, highlighters, and a half-eaten bowl of cereal that had gone cold hours ago. Marcus was 12 years old, and he was about to change his life. He just didn't know it yet. He wasn't the kind of kid who walked into rooms and demanded attention. He was the kind of kid who sat in the back and understood everything. The kind of kid teachers would whisper about in the hallway. The kind of kid who made adults feel strangely hopeful and strangely guilty at the same time. Because the world was not built to make it easy for a kid like Marcus. And the people in his life knew it. And they also knew there was absolutely nothing ordinary about him. Marcus lived with his grandmother, a woman named Dorothea Allen, but everyone who loved her called her. She was 67 years old, moved with a slight limp from a knee replacement that hadn't fully healed, and she made the best sweet potato pie in the entire state of Michigan. She would challenge anyone who disagreed, and she had never lost that argument. That had raised Marcus since he was 5 years old. That's when his mother, her daughter Renee, passed away from complications from lupus. It had been sudden, and it had been devastating, and it had done what it always did. She stood up straight. She held Marcus close, and she kept going. Because that was what you did. You kept going. Marcus's father had not been in the picture since before Marcus could remember. There were no hard feelings about it anymore. At least, that's what Marcus told himself. He had built a clean, clear space inside himself where that absence lived. He didn't visit it often. He didn't need to. What he had was... And he had his mind. And he had a hunger. A deep, relentless, almost frightening hunger to understand the world. How things worked. Why systems existed. What happened when someone with nothing decided to become something. He read everything. History, science, economics, philosophy. He checked out library books in stacks of 6 and returned them in 3 days. His school librarian, a quiet man named Mr. Okonkwo, had started setting books aside for him specifically. Books he thought Marcus wasn't ready for, just to see what would happen. Marcus always came back the next week having finished them. 3 weeks before that flight, Marcus received a letter. It came on a Tuesday. Plain envelope, no return label, just a very precise address printed in black ink. Called him from the kitchen when it arrived. She had already held it up to the light. She would admit that later and laugh, but she hadn't opened it. She handed it to him with both hands like it was something fragile. Marcus opened it carefully. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he sat down. The letter was from the National Youth Leadership Foundation, a nonprofit organization that identified high-performing students from underserved communities and sponsored their attendance at the annual Young Leaders Summit, a 5-day conference held in San Francisco, California, where the country's most promising young minds gathered to meet innovators, executives, scientists, and policymakers. To learn, to connect, to be seen. Marcus had applied 7 months earlier. He had written the application essay in 1 sitting, 2 hours, barely looked up, and when he was done he had printed it out, read it at the kitchen table, and she had gone completely silent for a long moment before saying, very quietly, "Baby, I think you got it." He had gotten it. Not just a spot at the conference. A full scholarship. Hotel. Transportation. Meals. and a round-trip first-class airline ticket because the Foundation believed, specifically and intentionally, that the young people they selected should travel with dignity. That was the word they used in the letter.
Dignity.
The Foundation's director, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, had written that word personally in the welcome note tucked inside the envelope. We believe every young leader deserves to arrive with dignity. Marcus read that line 4 times. He folded the letter carefully. He placed it back in the envelope. He looked up at, and for the first time in a very long time, maybe since his mother's funeral, maybe longer, Marcus Allen let himself cry. Not a lot, just enough. That pulled him in and held him and didn't say a single word, which was exactly right. The next 3 weeks were a blur of preparation. That bought him 2 new button-down shirts from the department store. He packed and repacked his bag 5 times. He printed out his boarding pass and his itinerary and his Foundation credentials and placed them all in a clear plastic sleeve that he kept in the front pocket of his backpack. He was not going to be unprepared. He was not going to give anyone any reason to doubt him. He thought about that, more than he should have, probably. More than a 12-year-old should have to think about it. But Marcus knew the world. He was 12, and he knew the world. The morning of the flight, that drove him to the airport in her 2009 Honda Civic with the cracked dashboard and the air conditioning that only worked on the driver's side. She walked him to the security line, as far as she could go. And before he stepped into the line, she took him by the shoulders and looked at him with those deep, steady eyes of hers. She said, "You remember what I told you." He said, "Stay calm. Let them expose themselves." She nodded. She straightened his collar. She said, "You belong everywhere you are. Don't you ever let anyone make you forget that." Then she kissed his forehead and stepped back and waved once, and Marcus Allen picked up his backpack and walked through security alone. He moved through the airport with a kind of quiet confidence that was almost startling to watch. He knew his gait. He found a seat, pulled out a book, a thick biography of Thurgood Marshall that Mr. Okonkwo had set aside for him, and he read until boarding began. When the announcement came for first-class passengers, he stood up, placed his bookmark carefully, zipped his bag, and walked to the gate. The agent scanned his pass, smiled, said, "Have a wonderful flight." He thanked her. He walked down the jetway. He found seat 3A, window seat, first row after the divider. He settled in. He placed his backpack under the seat in front of him. He looked out the oval window at the tarmac, at the early morning sky, at the pale orange light climbing up from the horizon. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. And then he heard the boarding door open again. And he heard a voice.
Loud.
Self-assured. The voice of a man who had never once in his life questioned whether he belonged somewhere. "I told them first class. I specifically told them first class." If you've been with Marcus since Detroit, hit subscribe right now. Because what happens next on this plane is going to make your jaw drop, and we're just getting started. Comment below. When was the last time someone underestimated you, and you proved them completely wrong? Tell me your story. His name was Gerald Whitmore. And you need to understand something about Gerald Whitmore before we go any further, because understanding him is the only way to understand the scale of what was about to happen. Gerald Whitmore was 44 years old, a regional director for a mid-sized commercial real estate firm based in Chicago, Illinois. He was the kind of man who wore his success loudly, not in ways that were obvious, but in ways that added up. The watch that caught the light every time he moved his hand. The particular way he spoke to service workers, not quite rude, but not quite human either. The absolute, unshakable assumption that every space he entered had been designed with him in mind. He was traveling with his wife, Candace, and his 15-year-old son, Bryce. Candace was polished in a way that felt studied, everything about her coordinated, controlled, curated. Bryce had his father's jawline and his mother's silence, and the particular exhausted look of a teenager who had long ago learned to disappear when his father was performing. Gerald had booked seats 3C and 3D for himself and Candace. Bryce was in 4A, standard configuration. But when Gerald entered the first-class cabin and scanned the row, and saw Marcus sitting in 3A, something shifted in his face. Something subtle. Something Marcus recognized immediately because Marcus had been reading faces like that his entire life. Gerald stopped in the aisle. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the seat number. He looked back at Marcus. He said, loudly enough for the surrounding rows to hear, "Are you serious right now?" Marcus didn't look up from his book immediately. He finished the sentence he was reading. Then he looked up, calmly, and met Gerald's eyes. Gerald said, "Is there a problem with your seat assignment?" Marcus said, "No, sir." "No problem." Gerald said, "Then, why are you in this row?" Marcus held up his boarding pass. Steady hand. 3A, that's me. Gerald stared at the pass. Something moved through him, a recalculation. Then he straightened up and turned to the flight attendant who had been watching from the galley. Her name was Sandra. She had been a flight attendant for 11 years. She was good at her job. And right now, everything in her body was telling her that the next 60 seconds were going to define how the rest of this flight went. Gerald said, "I think there's been a mistake with the seating." Sandra said carefully, "Do you have your boarding pass, sir? Let me take a look." Gerald handed it over without looking away from Marcus. Sandra checked it. She looked at Marcus's pass. She looked at the seat numbers. She said, "Everything looks correct. You're 3C and," she gestured to Marcus, "this passenger is in 3A. Gerald said, "That's not possible." Sandra said, "I'm sorry?" Gerald said, slowly, precisely, like he was explaining something to someone who was having difficulty keeping up, "That is not possible. I booked this row specifically." Sandra said, "Sir, rows in first class have multiple seats. You booked 3C. "I know what I booked." He cut her off. He wasn't yelling. Gerald Whitmore was not the type to yell in public. He was the type to cut. "What I'm telling you is that there has clearly been some kind of error, and I need you to look into it. Now." Candace had settled quietly into 3D. Bryce had disappeared into 4A and pulled out his earbuds. He was listening. He just wasn't showing it. Marcus turned back to his book. This was the moment Gerald noticed that the boy was not rattled. And that bothered him in a way he hadn't expected. He sat down in 3C. But he wasn't done. Over the next 6 minutes, while other passengers finished boarding, while the cabin hummed with pre-flight activity, while the early sun pushed fully over the horizon outside, Gerald Whitmore held a low, steady conversation with his wife that was absolutely designed to be heard by the person next to them. It's a liability issue, is what it is. You just can't leave these things up to chance. I'm going to speak to someone before we push back. This isn't right. Marcus kept reading. At minute 7, Gerald pressed the call button. Sandra appeared. She was composed. Professional. Gerald lowered his voice. "I'd like to speak with you privately." "One moment." She leaned in. He said, quietly but not quietly enough, "I will offer a significant upgrade fee, a personal one, directly to you, if you can find a way to relocate this passenger to a seat more appropriate to." He paused. He chose his words with the care of someone who had been in HR meetings before. "To a different section of the plane." Sandra straightened up. Her face had gone very still. Gerald continued, "I'm talking for $100. Cash. I have it right now. It would be a simple reassignment. Economy plus has plenty of room. He'd be comfortable. Everyone would be comfortable." Sandra said nothing for 3 full seconds. And then Marcus closed his book. Not dramatically. Not with a slap. He simply closed it, placed it on his tray table, folded his hands, and turned to look at Gerald Whitmore directly. He said, quiet and clear, "You don't have to answer him." The cabin went still. Not completely. There were still the sounds of overhead bins closing, of a baby murmuring 2 rows back, of the engines warming up somewhere beneath the floor. But the particular atmosphere of that row, of the first 4 rows of that first-class cabin, went completely still. Gerald turned to look at Marcus. And for the first time he actually looked at him. Not a glance. Not a categorization. A look. Marcus looked back. He didn't blink. Gerald said, "Excuse me. I was not speaking to you." Marcus said, "I know. You were speaking about me. That's different." Gerald's jaw tightened. "You need to learn to stay out of adult conversations." Marcus said calmly. You're trying to bribe a flight attendant to move me out of a seat I paid for. That involves me. The word bribe landed in the cabin like something physical. Several people looked up. A woman in 2B shifted in her seat. A man across the aisle, late 30s, dark jacket, lowered his magazine and did not raise it again. Gerald said, I am not bribing anyone. I am simply making a request, with cash, to move me specifically. That is not. Sir. Sandra's voice was steady now. Something had settled in her. I'm going to need you to take your seat. The boarding process is almost complete. Gerald looked at her. Something assessed in his eyes. He had been managed before. He didn't like it. He sat back. But his hands were tight on the armrests. Marcus picked up his book again. He didn't feel calm, by the way. It's important that you understand that. Inside that 12-year-old chest, his heart was hammering. He could hear it in his ears. His fingers were cold. He was scared. He was absolutely, legitimately scared because he was 12 and he was alone on a plane and a large, wealthy adult man was trying to remove him from his seat. And he knew, the way you know certain things when you have been black in America your entire life, even your short life, that this situation could go very wrong very quickly and that it would not necessarily be the right person who ended up hurt by it. But he also heard his grandmother's voice. Stay calm. Let them expose themselves. So he stayed calm. And he let the plane finish boarding. For about 20 minutes after pushback, things were not fine exactly, but contained. Gerald ordered a drink. Candace stared at her phone. Bryce had fallen asleep against the window. Marcus read. The flight attendants did their service quietly and efficiently. The plane leveled out above the clouds. And then Gerald Whitmore pressed the call button again. This time, he didn't bother to lower his voice. I want to speak to someone with actual authority. Not cabin crew. I want the senior officer on this flight. Sandra said, Sir, what is the nature of your concern? He said, My concern is that this child is traveling alone in first class, unsupervised, and I believe that is a liability issue for the airline. I want it documented that I have raised this concern, and I want to know what the airline's policy is for unaccompanied minors in premium cabin seating. This was clever. Marcus recognized it as clever. It wasn't an attack anymore, it was a policy question. It was the kind of escalation that sounded reasonable on its surface and was designed to activate bureaucracy, to make Marcus look like a problem that needed to be solved rather than a passenger who needed to be respected. Marcus reached into the front pocket of his backpack. He removed the clear plastic sleeve. He unzipped it. He took out 2 sheets of paper. He laid them on his tray table. He said, I'm a registered unaccompanied minor with the airline. That's the first form. The second is my foundation credential, which includes the name and direct number of Dr. Patricia Osei, who booked this ticket. And she answers her phone. Sandra took both forms. She read them. Her posture changed slightly, a very small shift, but visible. She looked at Gerald. She said, Sir, this passenger has all appropriate documentation for unaccompanied minor travel. His seating assignment is valid. Gerald said, That doesn't address my concern about appropriate section placement. Sandra said, First class is an appropriate section for any passenger with a valid first-class ticket. Sir. That last word, sir, had about 1 millimeter of edge on it. Just enough. Gerald's face did something complicated. He said, I want to speak to the captain. The man in the dark jacket across the aisle said, under his breath but loudly enough, Oh, come on, man. A woman behind them made a short, sharp sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. Gerald turned around. I'm sorry. Is this amusing to you people? You people. The cabin temperature dropped by about 10 degrees. The woman who had made the sound, mid-50s, silver-haired, reading glasses pushed up on her head, looked at Gerald with a very level expression and said, You should probably stop talking. Gerald said, I don't think you understand. She said, I understand perfectly. Bryce, in the row behind, was no longer asleep. He was looking at the back of his father's head with an expression that Marcus would think about for a long time afterward. It wasn't shame, exactly. It was something older than shame. Something that had been living in that boy for years. Gerald turned back to the front. His face was red now, a specific high-pressure red that had moved up from his collar to his temples. He pointed at Sandra and said, quietly, through his teeth, "Get me the senior officer.
Right now."
Or I will be making a call to your airline's corporate office the moment we land that will make this entire interaction your problem for the next several years." Sandra looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'll get the senior flight officer." She walked to the front galley. Marcus set down his book for the second time. He reached back into his backpack. His hand found something in the interior pocket, something small and rectangular. He didn't take it out yet. He just felt the weight of it. He looked out the window. They were somewhere over Indiana, probably. The ground was a quilt of white and gray fields, orderly and cold, and very far away. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about the letter. He thought about the word dignity. He thought about a lesson his mother had given him once. He could barely remember her face now, but he remembered her voice, and he remembered this. She had said in that voice, "Baby, some people are going to look at you and decide who you are before you open your mouth. And you have two choices. You can spend your energy trying to change their minds, or you can spend your energy becoming so undeniably yourself that their minds become irrelevant." He had been becoming himself for 12 years. He was ready. The curtain at the front of the cabin moved. The senior flight officer, a man named Captain James Holloway, short, gray-haired, with a particular calm of someone who had handled 17 emergency landings and had zero patience for nonsense, stepped through and looked at Gerald Whitmore. He said, "I understand you have a concern, sir." Gerald said, "I do. Several, actually." This is where things get serious. Subscribe right now so you never miss what happens next, because this channel is just getting started and the best moments are always ahead. I want to know, do you think Captain Holloway is going to side with Gerald, or does Marcus have something nobody expects? Drop your prediction below. Captain Holloway stood in the aisle with his hands clasped behind his back, and he looked at Gerald Whitmore with the particular expression of a man who had seen this exact type of situation before. Maybe not on a plane, maybe not with these exact people, but this situation. He said, "Go ahead, sir." Gerald straightened. He had been waiting for someone with authority, and now he had won, and he pressed forward with the confidence of a man who had spent decades winning arguments by controlling the room. He laid out his concerns systematically. The unaccompanied minor issue, the liability question, the appropriateness of seating. He was measured. He was articulate. He referenced airline policy twice, not accurately but convincingly enough that if you weren't paying close attention you might not catch the gap. He finished with, "I am simply asking for a resolution that is appropriate for everyone involved and that prioritizes the safety and comfort of all passengers in this cabin." Captain Holloway nodded slowly. He said, "And what resolution specifically are you proposing?" Gerald said, "Relocate the boy to Economy Plus. Immediately." Holloway said, "On what grounds?" Gerald paused. "I've outlined the grounds. You've raised questions. You haven't outlined grounds." Holloway's voice didn't change in tone or volume. He was simply precise. "Unaccompanied minors are permitted in first class with the proper documentation, which I've been informed this passenger has. Liability does not apply to a validly seated, properly documented passenger. Appropriateness is not a recognized criterion for involuntary reseating." He paused. "Do you have grounds, sir?" Gerald's face was doing that complicated thing again. He said, "He is making other passengers uncomfortable." Holloway said, "Which passengers?" Gerald said, "Myself and my wife." Holloway said, "And your discomfort stems from?" Silence. A beat of silence that stretched across the entire first-class cabin. Gerald said, "The situation has been tense since boarding." Holloway said, "I've been briefed on what created that tension, sir." Another silence. This one was different. It had weight to it. Gerald changed direction. He turned to Marcus. And this was, if you were watching closely, this was the moment where Gerald Whitmore made his final and most critical error. Because he had been performing for the authority figure. He had been trying to win the room. And now, frustrated and cornered, he turned to the actual source of his frustration, and he forgot to perform. He said to Marcus directly, "You think this is a game? You think you belong here? And Marcus, 12 years old, heart still hammering, hands still cold, looked at him with those steady, deep eyes, and said, I have something I'd like everyone to hear. He reached into his backpack. He pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind journalists used. The kind Mr. Okonkwo had lent him 2 years ago when Marcus had told him he wanted to start interviewing neighborhood business owners for a school project, and Marcus had never returned it, and Mr. Okonkwo had never asked for it back, because some things are a gift even when they look like a loan. Marcus placed it on the tray table. He pressed play. The first voice was clear and immediate. I will offer a significant upgrade fee, a personal one, directly to you, if you can find a way to relocate this passenger to a seat more appropriate to. Gerald moved forward. Stop that. Captain Holloway put one hand out, not touching Gerald, just placed in the air between them, and Gerald stopped. The recording continued. Every word, the offer, the amount, the framing. He'd be comfortable. Everyone would be comfortable. Then Marcus's voice. You don't have to answer him. Then the escalation. That child is traveling alone in first class, unsupervised. Then the threat. I will be making a call to your airline's corporate office the moment we land that will make this entire interaction your problem for the next several years. Every single word, in sequence, in context, in Gerald Whitmore's own voice. When it ended, the cabin was completely silent. Not the soft silence of people being polite. The hard silence of people processing something real. The woman with the silver hair and the reading glasses had her hands folded in her lap. The man in the dark jacket was looking at Gerald with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was moving in that direction. 2 rows back, someone had stopped pretending to sleep. Sandra, standing in the galley entrance, was looking at the recorder on that tray table with something that might have been relief. Captain Holloway turned to Gerald Whitmore. He said, with exactly the same quiet, level tone he had used throughout, Sir, attempting to bribe a crew member is a federal violation under Title 49 of the United States Code. Threatening a crew member with professional retaliation in connection with a bribe attempt compounds that significantly. He paused. I am going to ask you to come with me. Gerald said, he was recording without consent. Holloway said, Illinois, where this flight originated, is a one-party consent state. This passenger had every legal right to record a conversation in which he was a participant. He paused again. Please come with me. Candace Whitmore made a sound.
A very small sound.
And then she looked at her hands. Bryce Whitmore looked out the window. His jaw was set in a way that was somehow both his father's and completely his own. Gerald Whitmore stood up. He was still red, but it was different now. Not high-pressure red, not the red of someone who is about to win. It was the red of someone who had just realized in real time that he had lost.
Badly. Publicly.
Permanently. He walked to the front of the cabin. Captain Holloway followed. The curtain closed behind them. The cabin breathed. Marcus placed the recorder back in his backpack. He zippered the pocket. He straightened his tray table. He picked up his book. He found his page. The man in the dark jacket across the aisle said, quietly, Kid. Marcus looked up. The man gave him one slow nod. No words, just the nod. Marcus nodded back. He went back to his book. Candace sat very still in 3D for a long moment. Then she unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up, walked to the back of the cabin, and did not return for 45 minutes. What happened in that front galley between Captain Holloway and Gerald Whitmore took approximately 11 minutes. Gerald Whitmore was formally cautioned under federal aviation guidelines. A report was filed. The airline's legal team was notified via the pilot's communication system. At landing, Gerald Whitmore and his wife would be met by both airline security and a Federal Aviation Authority representative who had been radioed ahead. But that is later. Right now, at 38,000 feet over the American Midwest, Gerald Whitmore came back through that curtain alone. He walked to his seat without looking at anyone. He sat down. He did not order another drink. He did not press the call button. He did not speak. The cabin settled back into the soft hum of flight. And Marcus Allen turned a page. Marcus just played that recording. Subscribe so you're here for the aftermath. What happens when that video gets out? You will not want to miss what comes next. Comment. What do you think was going through Gerald's mind when that recording started playing? Give me one word. The plane landed at San Francisco International Airport at 11:47 in the morning, Pacific time, under a sky that was pale and bright and wide in the way that California skies are wide, like someone had simply decided there should be more of it. Marcus gathered his backpack. He waited for the rows ahead to clear. He stood, adjusted the straps on his shoulders, and walked off the plane. He came through the gate into the terminal and found a woman standing near the first pillar with a printed sign that read Marcus Allen, Young Leaders Summit, and he felt something warm move through his chest. The woman was young, maybe 25, with a wide smile and a foundation lanyard. She extended her hand and said, "Marcus, we are so glad you made it. I'm Priya. I'll be your liaison for the week." "How was the flight?" Marcus said. "Interesting." She laughed.
She didn't know yet.
None of them knew yet. The man in the dark jacket had known. His name was David Chun. He was 39 years old. He was a freelance journalist who wrote long-form pieces on race and public policy, and he was traveling to San Francisco for a conference of his own. He had been in seat 2D, one row ahead and across the aisle, with a perfect diagonal view of the entire interaction. He was also the kind of journalist who had learned over 17 years to tell the difference between a story that fades and a story that matters. And what he had witnessed, a 12-year-old boy, traveling alone, with a recorder, with documentation, with a grandmother's steady voice living inside him, that was not a story that faded. He had filmed 9 minutes of it on his phone. Not aggressively. Quietly. He'd held the phone at waist level for the last part. The recording playback, Holloway's response, Gerald walking back to his seat. Clean footage.
Clear audio.
Before he deplaned, he posted 47 seconds of it to his social media accounts with a 3-sentence caption. "Watched a 12-year-old handle a first-class bribe attempt better than most adults I know. Kid had a recorder and documentation and never raised his voice. This is someone's child. Remember that." By the time Marcus had checked into his hotel room and called to tell her he'd arrived safe, she answered on the first ring. She always answered on the first ring. The clip had 14,000 views. Said, "How was it, baby? How was the flight?" Marcus said, "Grandma, I need to tell you something. But first, you should probably know it's going to be on the internet." She was quiet for a second. She said, "Tell me." He told her. By the time he finished, she had gone quiet in that particular way of hers. Not upset.
Processing.
Then she said, "Did you stay calm?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Did you let them expose themselves?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "And you're safe? You're there? You're okay?" He said, "I'm okay, Grandma." She exhaled slowly. She said, "All right then. Let me call your Aunt Sheila before she sees it herself and has a whole episode." By midnight Pacific time, the clip had 2.7 million views. The comment section was running overwhelmingly in one direction. People were angry. People were moved. People were tagging family members and friends with captions like, "Watch this," and "I am not okay," and "This baby," and they really try to bribe a flight attendant over a child's seat. "I am shaking." The hashtag Marcus Allen was trending by 9 p.m. Eastern. By morning, it was #1. News desks picked it up before sunrise. A producer at a major morning news program had seen it at 4 a.m. during her overnight monitoring shift and immediately forwarded it to her senior editor with a single line, "We need this child and his grandmother on tomorrow." 3 other programs had the same idea simultaneously. David Chen's original post was being cited in every article. He gave 2 interviews before 8 a.m. By the time Marcus woke up in his hotel room, groggy, disoriented, jet-lagged, still technically 12 years old, his name had been spoken on national television twice. He found out when Priya knocked on his door at 7:30 with coffee and a look on her face that was somewhere between excited and overwhelmed. She said, "Good morning."
"So,
"There's some news." Marcus said, "How many views?" She looked at her phone. 41 million. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He said, "Okay." She said, "Dr. Osei is on a call right now with a lot of people. Everyone is going to want to protect you through this. You're not going to have to deal with it alone. But we wanted you to know before you turned on your own phone." Marcus nodded. He picked up his phone. There were 63 missed calls. Most of them he didn't recognize. 3 were from numbers saved in his contacts: Mr. Okonkwo and Bryce Whitmore, who had somehow, somewhere, found his number and had sent a text at 11:30 p.m. that read simply, "I'm sorry about my dad. You were right. I've known for a long time." Marcus stared at that text for a long time. Then he typed back, "I know. Take care of yourself." He sent it. He put the phone down. He went and washed his face. He had a full day of summit activities starting at 9. There were panels to attend and people to meet and a keynote by a woman who had built a renewable energy company from a single patent in her garage. There was an afternoon workshop on civic technology. There was a dinner where young leaders sat with actual executives and had actual conversations and were treated, specifically and intentionally, as the future they were. Marcus was not going to miss any of it. What happened to Gerald Whitmore over the next 72 hours was swift and thorough in the way that these things sometimes are when the public decides it has seen enough. The airline issued a statement acknowledging the incident and confirming that a formal report had been filed with the FAA. Gerald's employer issued its own statement 2 days later announcing that he was no longer with the company, effective immediately, following an internal review. His LinkedIn profile, which had been public and active that morning, was deleted by early afternoon. Candace Whitmore did not respond to any media requests. Bryce Whitmore transferred schools in September. These are the facts. Before the final moment, hit subscribe. What Marcus does in the last 2 minutes of this story is the reason this entire video exists. Don't miss it. Which part of this story hit you the hardest? The recording? The text from Bryce? On the phone? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. On the last night of the Young Leaders Summit, after the final dinner, after the keynote and the workshops and the panel discussions and the moments that Marcus Allen knew he would spend years unpacking and returning to, after all of that, he went outside. The hotel had a rooftop terrace on the 14th floor with a low railing and a view of the bay. The water was black and silver, the bridge lit up in the distance. The city spread out below like a conversation that had been going on for 100 years and wasn't close to finished. Marcus stood at the railing alone. He was still 12 years old. In 3 months, he would be 13. He was still the boy from the apartment in Detroit with the index cards and the cold cereal and the grandmother with the bad knee who made the best sweet potato pie in the state of Michigan. He was also, somehow, now the boy that 41 million people had watched. The boy who trended. The boy in the recording. An email had come that afternoon from a publisher asking if he had considered writing a book. He was 12 years old, and someone had asked him about a book. He had laughed. The first time, he had really laughed all week. He had forwarded it to, and she had called back immediately, laughing too, saying, "Baby, they are out of their minds. You are 12. You have not written a book yet. But maybe," and she had let the maybe hang there, warm and open. He thought about the flight. He thought about Gerald Whitmore sitting back down in that seat with his hands on the armrests, the high-pressure red gone from his face, replaced by something Marcus recognized. Not quite shame, not quite understanding, but the first faint light of consequence. The moment when the world stops confirming the story you've been telling yourself about who you are and what you're owed. He thought about Bryce's text. "I've known for a long time." What a weight to carry. What a thing to know. At 15, about someone you're supposed to look up to. He thought about Sandra, the flight attendant, who had held the line when it mattered, and who had called the foundation's office the day after landing to say she was sorry it had happened, and then to say, quickly, before she hung up, that Marcus was one of the most composed young people she had ever encountered in 11 years of this work. He thought about his mother. He thought about her voice. Become so undeniably yourself that their minds become irrelevant. He had been working on that his whole life. He didn't think you ever finished working on it. He thought it was probably the main work of being human, becoming undeniably yourself, in a world that offers you, every day, 1,000 reasons to shrink. Marcus had not shrunk. Not on that plane. Not in that seat. Not when the money was offered. Not when the voice went cold. Not when the authority figure walked through the curtain, and the scales could have tipped any direction. He had stayed calm. He had let them expose themselves. He had been so undeniably himself that the rest of it, the bribe, the threats, the performance of power, had simply collapsed under the weight of that truth. The bay glittered below him. He took out his phone. He called. She answered on the first ring. He said, "I'm on the roof. You should see this city." She said, "I can't see anything, baby. You're on the phone."
He laughed.
He said, "Grandma, I just wanted to say, I'm okay. I'm really okay." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in that low, steady voice that had been the first voice he remembered and would probably be the last voice he truly trusted, "I know you are. You've always been okay." "That was never the question," he said. "What was the question?" She said, "Whether the world was going to be okay enough to deserve you." He stood on that rooftop for a long time after they hung up. The wind came in off the bay, cold and clean, and carrying something that felt like possibility. He was 12 years old. He was from Detroit. His grandmother had a bad knee and made a great pie. His mother had given him a voice before she left. He had a recorder in his backpack and a boarding pass that said 3A and a foundation credential that said his name. He belonged on every roof he stood on. He belonged in every seat he sat in, not because he had proven it. Not because 41 million people had watched. Not because a captain had agreed or a recording had played or a family had been removed. He belonged because belonging was never theirs to give. It never had been. They saw a boy and they made a decision. They didn't see the truth. And that cost them everything. But it didn't take anything from him. Because Marcus Jerome Allen, 12 years old, Detroit, Michigan, seat 3A, never needed their permission to belong. He never did. And neither do you. If Marcus's story meant something to you today, hit subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. This story deserves to be heard by as many people as possible. And we'll see you in the next one. Last question, and I want you to really think about it. What is one space in your life where you've been made to feel like you don't belong? And what would it mean to walk back in knowing it was never theirs to decide?
Tell me.
I'm listening.